everybody, and welcome to the channel. In today's video, Charles Obart is going to be talking about the angles, the two coordinate systems, and blending house systems. If you are enjoying our videos, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more great content, and also to like, share, and we'd also love to hear your comments too. As a reminder, KeplerCollege's fall semester is in full swing. We offer classes from beginner to advanced levels in our certificate and diploma programs. Our instructors specialized in many branches of astrology, from medical to evolutionary to Vedic and many other fantastic areas. If you would like to learn more, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And without further ado, let's get into the video.
We're talking about angles and multiple house systems here. And basically what I figured out is in order to understand multiple house systems, you really need to understand what angles are, and that we've got two different kinds of angles in astrology. Both are important. The different kinds of angles are what give rise to the different house systems. So the first part of the seminar is going to be kind of setting the groundwork for what are these kinds of angles and how do they apply. And then the most important part of this is, given that we've got multiple kinds of angles, given that we've got multiple kinds of house systems, how do we use them? And how do we use them together? So again, to sort of quick answer the question, the burning question, which is the best kind of house system for you to use? The answer is yes. So angles. Angles are squares. Angles are right angles, 90-degree angle. And the important thing about angles is they're points of tension, they're points of activity, they're points of focus. So angles are where the action is when you're dealing with a chart here, okay? Now, the problem is that in astrology, we're dealing with different sets of coordinate systems in terms of how we divide up space here. The one is the zodiacal coordinate system, and this is the 12 signs of the zodiac that we're familiar with. 360-degree circle where each of the signs is 30 degrees. This is defined by the apparent path of the sun through the zodiac through the year. That path of the sun, that circle is called the ecliptic. So that's one coordinated system. But the other coordinated system, I'm calling the local coordinate system, and that's based on where you are right on Earth and how the heavens appear relative to you on the Earth. So like if you go out and you look up at the sky, you can see like a horizontal line going to either side of you. You could visualize a vertical line in front of you. And the thing is, both of these coordinate systems are active, but they don't line up with each other. It's rather like you've got a pair of intersecting circular discs at angles to each other. It's like if you had a pair of plates or discs or something like that, they're intersecting there. If you were looking face on at one of the discs, the other disc would be kind of off in an angle, so you'd see something more like an ellipse. It's the fact that we've got both of these systems, but they don't line up, that causes the issues that we have to deal with astrology and houses. Okay, now here's one of the sets of the angles, the zodiac, 12 signs. Every one of the signs is taking 30 degrees, and the angles, the signs of the same mode, either cardinal, fixed, or mutable, are all angular to each other. So like I've got that blue cross here going through all the cardinal signs. The cardinal signs are all in a relationship of either square or opposition to each other. So Aries is square Cancer, Cancer is square Libra, Libra is square Capricorn. You could think of this as the cardinal cross, okay? Similarly, if you started at Taurus, the cross would be made of the 4 fixed signs. If you started in Gemini, the cross would be made of the 4 mutable signs. So this zodiac set of squares is always active. That's one set of squares. Now, the other set of squares has to do with where you are on Earth. It would be like If you knew as soon as you came out of the womb that you were going to be an astrologer and you went trucking outside and looked out at the sky, you'd see something like this. If you were pacing south, you could picture a horizontal line going off on either side of you. That's your horizon, okay? And that horizon, that east-west line, that gives rise to the ascendant-descendant axis, okay? And then again, if you were facing south, if you pictured that you had either a straight line, straight vertical line in front of you, or a big vertical circle going around and over you, that forms a vertical straight line, and the midheaven falls along that axis. And the ascendant and the midheaven, in terms of where you are on Earth, are always at right angles to each other. Okay? Now, they're called, the ascendant and the midheaven are called the mundane angles. And when we draw a chart, what we're looking for is where these two different coordinate systems intersect, where the zodiac cuts across our local coordinate system. By definition, the ascendant is where the ecliptic or the zodiac meets the horizon. That defines the horizontal axis. The midheaven is where the ecliptic meets that vertical line that's called the prime meridian. So it's where the two different systems intersect. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about angularity and the importance of it. So before we talk about house systems, you really need to understand angularity related terms of strength. I'm going to start down in that lower left corner because this is how most people probably start to think about it. The houses by the first house, the ascendant there, are considered to be angular. Angular is strong, active, okay? The house next to the angular houses is called succeedent, which is succeeding, the one after. They're strong, but they're not as strong as the angular houses. And then the third kind of house is called cadent. It's from a word that means weak or falling away. That's the least strong kind of house in terms of angularity. Now, if you look at what we've got across the top of this circle here, that's looking at these three in terms of the clockwise path of the sun and the other planets all around the sky in 24 hours. If you're in the succeedent houses, that's considered to be increasing in strength because it's moving towards the angle. So like a planet in the 11th house is considered as getting stronger. It's moving up towards the 10th and the angle. Anything in the 10th house is considered to be angular or peaking. It's at its strongest. And then when it gets past the angle, it's cadent, and you could picture it hitting a peak where it hits that midheaven and then rapidly falling off in strength. That's what cadent means, falling away. So they're the concepts that you play with when you deal with angularity and house systems. Keep these angularity concepts in mind. They're really important in terms of how we interpret this. So given that, we've got two sets of right angles now. We got the zodiac set, which is the signs that are in a square to each other. And then we've got the local set of right angles, which is the right angle formed by the ascendant and the midheaven axis. Both sets of angles are active. Both are important, but they do not line up with each other. And that's where we start getting into house systems. So given that we're dividing our circle up into 4 quadrants here, okay? The 12 houses are formed by taking each of these quadrants and divide them up into 3, which is what we call the houses in each of the quadrants. So we end up with 12 houses. There are 2 main kinds of house systems, and they're based on those 2 different coordinate systems that we just talked about. Whole sign houses are based on the zodiac coordinate system, and the various quadrant houses are all based on that local set of coordinates, the ascendant and midheaven axes. Probably most of the house systems you've heard of are quadrant types. Placidus is a quadrant type, Coke is a quadrant type. Excuse me, I need to get a piece of licorice here. Coke is a quadrant type, Porphyry is one. And the difference between all of those quadrant types, they all share that the ascendant is the start of the first house and the midheaven is the start of the 10th. They vary in terms of how they divide up the quadrants. So you could think of those as being like a family of different kinds of house systems. So something else I want to emphasize, this problem of different kinds of house systems that we're talking about here, this isn't a new problem. This has been known about for thousands of years. You can find evidence even in some of the Hellenistic texts where they might be referring to whole sign, they might be referring to quadrants, sometimes it's ambiguous. And during the, I'll call it the late traditional period, the flowering of astrology in the Arabic civilization, both house systems were in use. They knew about both of them. They talked about both of them. And they referred to them as different kinds of systems. The quadrant or local kind of house system, they called houses by measurement. And the whole sign or zodiac kind of systems, they called houses by counting. So this isn't a new issue. This is one that's been around for a long, long time. I want to show you now single chart in the two different ways, in whole sign and then in quadrant, and then a map that I use that shows me the two at once. I'll be talking about this chart a bit later. This is an example of a whole sign house system. The location of the ascendant determines the first house. You notice the ascendant is 18 degrees Capricorn here. That means that the entire sign Capricorn is the entire first house. And then each of the other zodiac signs is a whole house by itself. This is sometimes also called sign house. So Capricorn's the first house, Aquarius is the second house, Pisces is the third house, and so on. And you'll notice in this chart here, the midheaven is not 10th house, it falls over in the 11th house. This is showing a case of where the two coordinate systems don't line up, they're askew each other. So that's whole sign. This is a typical quadrant house chart. This is Placidus. If you learned astrology before whole signs became popular, this was most likely the kind of chart layout that you were familiar with, where that horizontal red line is the ascendant descendant axis, and that's start of the first and seventh house. That vertical blue line there is the midheaven or MCIC axis. IC stands for Imum Caeli, which is the bottom of the heavens. And then each of the houses are a certain amount of degrees, but you'll notice now, not all the houses are the same number of zodiac degrees. Like you take a look up at the 11th house there. You will notice the 11th house starts at 6 degrees of Sagittarius, and it ends at 26 degrees roughly. So the 11th house is 20 zodiac degrees. By comparison, if you look at that first house there, the first house contains, it starts at 18 Capricorn. It contains the last 11 or 12 degrees of Capricorn. All of the sign Aquarius sits in the first house, and then the first couple of degrees of Pisces sits in the first house. Aquarius is, if you've heard of an intercepted sign, this is an example of Aquarius as an intercepted sign. In this house system, Aquarius does not fall on any one of the house cusps. This is the view, this is my favorite view of houses, and this is the kind of view that I will be using with all the examples that we're going to be looking at today. What's going on with this view, if you look at that outside ring there, the numbering on that outside ring is showing the whole sign house numbers, where again, each of the houses is all of the sign. That inside ring is showing the quadrant house numbers. This particular chart is done with Placidus there. So that horizontal red line is the ascendant-descendant axis, and that kind of slanted red line going from Scorpio to Taurus, that's the midheaven IC axis. And exactly like we saw in that previous view, you'll notice if you look up at the 11th house, all of the 11th house fits within the sign Sagittarius. And if you look at that first house includes a chunk of Capricorn, all of Aquarius, and a little piece of Pisces. So here's where we're seeing both sets of angles at the same time. If this makes you a little bit dizzy, welcome to the club. This has been making astrologers dizzy for 2,000 years. So the question we're going to be asking today is, okay, given the fact that we've got two sets of angles, given both sets of angles are active, what do we do about them? How do we interpret them? And how do we interpret them in a way that does justice to both of them? Now, what I'm going to be doing in the next couple slides is sharing some ways that these two house systems were described in traditional texts, how they thought of them. One way, and this is a very, very common one for people who favor whole sign houses, this is likely the most common way. This is how I learned when I first learned whole sign houses, is you can view the two different house systems as serving different purposes, where whole sign houses have to do with house topics, but quadrant houses are what measure angularity or strength. That's one way to do it. So if you look up at the upper half of the chart there, you will notice in the sign Libra, Saturn is in the sign Libra, which is the whole sign 10th house. So you would say that Saturn in this chart has to do with 10th house topics, which is occupation, reputation, also any like supervisors you might have in the world, people who were over you, had authority, and so on. And by topic, it's 10th house. But if you look in the inner ring, Saturn is in the 9th house by quadrant. So Saturn is cadent. Saturn does not have the strong angularity. It's in the weaker cadent sign. If you look over at Mars there, Mars is right next to that red line, which is the midheaven line, and Mars is very, very strong by angle, but by topic, it's in the 11th whole sign house. So you would view Mars as being strong by angle, but topically you'd look to Mars for 11th house kinds of topics and not 10th house kinds of topics. This is a very, very common way to use the two houses, but it's not the only way. Now, if you look at traditional texts, you see they had language for whether or not a planet was moving towards one of the quadrant angles or was moving away from it. And they described that as advancing or retreating. Advancing means you were moving toward an angle and getting stronger. Retreating means you were moving away from an angle and getting weaker. So in this chart, Mars is advancing. It's in an angular house by the quadrant houses. It's getting stronger. It's a peak of strength. Saturn being in the 9th house, retreating in the sense that it's in a cadent house. This is similar to that using the quadrant houses for strength, but this is the language they used in the traditional texts. Now, this next one is interesting. I haven't played around much with this particular idea, but one of the things that they talked about, given that the midheaven didn't always fall in the whole sign 10th house, where is the best place for the midheaven? And the way they described it is if the midheaven was in the whole sign 10th house, this was considered to be an upright midheaven, and that was considered to be the best place to put the midheaven, the strongest. An angle, DMC, in an angular house by whole sign. If it wasn't in the whole sign 10th house, the next strongest place to be was the 11th house, because that is succedent, not as strong as angular, but still strong. And the weakest place to put the midheaven was in the 9th house, because the 9th house is cadent. Now, here's the case, and this is really curious, where it's judging the strength of the angle by which whole sign kind of house it fell in. I realize you will occasionally see, I've seen charts that have midheaven all the way over in the whole sign 8th house, very, very occasionally over in the whole sign 12th house. I'm not aware of any textual references to that in traditional text. My sense would be, and this is my making an intelligent guess, is the further away it is from upright, the less desirable that's considered to be. And by the way, if we have time, we may look at this example chart later. Now, you asked, what was the big discovery I made that made me decide to do that? Here's the discovery here. And before I talk about this, I need to do a shout out, and I thank you to my fellow astrologer and friend, Anthony Lewis, who's the person who brought this to my attention and who sent me down a rabbit hole that I have yet to get out of. This is out of the writings of the French astrologer Jean-Baptiste Morin, who was writing roughly in the latter half of the 1500s and the early half of the 1600s. And he knew about both house systems. This chart here, the chart of the Duke of Montmorency, you will notice I have Saturn circled there. Saturn is in the 9th house by whole sign. And Saturn is in the 8th house by quadrant. The quadrant chart style he used was called Regiomontanus. It's one of the space-based ones. And what Morin said is Saturn in this chart signified that the Duke would die in a foreign land. Do you see what he did is combine the meanings of the two house systems. This signifies that the Duke will die, 8th house, in a foreign land, 9th house. So he was not just paying attention to both sets of house meanings, he was combining them. Do you see? This is where I started doing some exploration about this interaction of combining of house meanings. And the entire rest of our time together here is going to be talking about how you combine the different meanings. So everything going forward here is going to be examples. And very important, I want to emphasize here, this is a new area of discovery. We as a community are only really starting to wrestle with this question now. So take what I'm doing as first suggestions. These are ideas for your further exploration yourself. I don't consider myself an authority on this. I've been playing with it for a bit and I found some exciting things. I want to share them with you. And now you can take it and go look through some charts on your own. Now, what I'm going to be doing here, there's two charts I'm going to look at. These are the ones that really gave me the idea that, okay, I need to use both. And I would emphasize, by the way, in looking at this, the better I knew the person whose chart I was looking at, the more I needed both house systems. After I do this first couple, we're going to take a nice major pause and breather. We'll do some questions. Then I'll go through some more examples and we can do some more questions. All right. This is the chart of my daughter. I don't have the chart data down there to keep it confidential for. And you notice that red line, the opposition I've got there. By far the most important part of this chart configuration, you've got 5 planets in a pretty darn tight opposition there. You got Venus, Sun, and Mars all over in Aries in a pretty darn tight opposition to Jupiter and Saturn, both over in Libra. Now let's look at house systems here. If you look in the outer ring, that opposition goes from 6th house to 12th house, okay? My daughter's a nurse. 6th house, 12th house is a perfect kind of emphasis for someone whose vocation is as a nurse. She knew she wanted to be a nurse fairly young. What she originally wanted to do was be a nurse who was working with people who were dying and who were in that final hospice situation, which is a 12th house kind of a situation. And also she has worked in senior care homes, advanced care homes, that kind of a thing. So 6th to 12th house describes my daughter's vocation. Now, if you look at the inner ring, it goes from 5th house to 11th house. My daughter's other passion is her children. She's always known she wanted to have children. She has 2 daughters. She is fanatically dedicated to her daughters and to her family. And the other thing she's dedicated to is an 11th house kind of topic. When she becomes part of a friend's community, she's very, very loyal. Like she was when she was in her late 20s or early 30s. If she had a high school friend who she hadn't seen in 10 years, who was going to get married, she would drive halfway across the country to be at that person's wedding. So that 5th house, 11th house axis describes another very, very important part of my daughter's life. I need the 6th, 12th axis to describe one part. I need the 5th, 11th house axis to describe the other part. So which house system do I need to use? Yes. This is the chart that convinced me I needed to pay attention to both. Isn't that a cool example, by the way? Isn't that an interesting chart? Actually, I got another personal example, but this might be a good time to just pause for a bit to make sure people are on board. Are there any questions that folks would like to raise, or can I get a bit of feedback at this point?
Yeah. Hey there, this is fascinating.
Isn't it cool stuff?
It's remarkable. Mind is a little blown right now.
Good.
And we have people that also agree in the chat. They're very excited. So let's go into some of the questions.
Absolutely.
At the beginning, someone asked about the ascendant, descendant, east-west direction.
Yes.
Are you able to explain that a little bit more for people?
Okay, yeah. When you're looking at a standard astrology chart, the standard point of view is you're facing dead south. So the ascendant would be due east from where you are. The descendant would be due west from you are. The sun rises at the ascendant and sets at the descendant, and rises in the east and sets in the west. Now, it doesn't rise exactly due east because the ecliptic isn't exactly lined up, but where the sun rises over in the direction of the east, that's your ascendant. And facing due south, you'd be facing the 10th house, and due north would be the 4th house there. Does that help?
I think it should. It was a good explanation. So,
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure it's great. And it's interesting because most people think the reverse, right? They say, oh, the bottom would seem to be the south, right? And then like looking at the chart.
Right, yeah,
in a
this,
2D.
by the way, because of this, because I'm so used to looking at astrology charts, I just get so totally goofed up when I try to visualize directions on a map, because I'm used to this. But yeah, if you look at the directions assigned to the 4 angles, the ascendant gets east, the descendant gets west, due north gets the midheaven, due south gets the, what do you call it? The 4th house, the IC.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, next question. Someone would like a brief, they have a brief, this was asked earlier, so just a brief reminder of which house system, like they ask specifically, is the equal house system whole house sign or quadrant based? And the same person
Great
asked
question.
which system are you using for the quadrant houses?
Okay. Well, first of all, equal house, that one's sort of a hybrid, because what that one does, equal house, and by the way, it's a great house system. I used to use it before I discovered whole sign. For equal houses, the degree of the ascendant determines the beginning of the first house, and then it counts 30 zodiac degrees. So like if you had the ascendant at 18 Capricorn, the cusp of the 2nd house would be 18 Aquarius, the cusp of the 3rd house would be 18 Pisces, cusp of the 4th house would be 18 Aries, and so on. And that's one, again, where the midheaven does not always fall in the equal sign 10th house. So that one's sort of a hybrid system, but I think it's closer to whole sign than it is to quadrant. As to which quadrant house systems I use, there's 2 of them I look at. I've got some slides with one, some the other. Placidus I use just because it's so very, very common. And the house system of the quadrant ones that I like the best is porphyry. And I do that without going into a lot of detail. There's a very fine astrologer named Bruce Schofield who did a very thorough study of the various kinds of house systems to figure out which of the intermediate house cusps have timing hitting a house cusp, in which of the house system works best. And he found that porphyry works the best. That's the one that I favor. So I'm using some porphyry and some placidus.
Okay, great. That's great explanation. We have a lot of people asking if it is possible to, how you're able to merge house systems. Is that possible to see 2 house systems within the same chart, or did you just create this?
No, this particular wheel, I did not create this wheel. This particular wheel is out of the program Janus. And it's got this particular view. It calls it I believe it calls it a hybrid view. If you want to see this kind of view in like solar fire, what you can do is make sure you have a kind of view that's called proportional, where all of the zodiac signs is exactly the same. And then choose one of the quadrant house systems. And if you look at that, then you'll see the zodiac signs around the outside ring. And even if it doesn't have the number on them, it's fairly easy to count zodiac signs. And then you'll have the quadrant lines drawn on the inside. You see what I mean? You should be able to get that view off of astro.com also.
Great. You are just continue to blow my mind over here.
Isn't this wild stuff?
Yeah. Can you spell Janus for us?
Sure. Janus. It is, I believe, a Roman god or Greek. I think it's Roman. It's the god of, it faces in 2 directions. It's the god that's the month January is related to the god Janus. If you are interested in traditional astrology, Janus is my favorite astrology program, hands down.
Okay.
It's very, very good. Solar fire is also a very, very good. I think solar fire in general is aimed more for modern houses. I don't want to knock solar fire. It's got a lot of great features, but Janus is my preferred program, and all these chart wheels are out of Janus.
Great. Fantastic. We're going to move on maybe after one more question because we have a lot coming in. People just are loving this presentation, which I completely understand because I do too. So let's see. One more question.
Sure.
Okay. Do you use bounds when using both house systems, or do bounds become redundant?
Oh, I absolutely use bounds. Bounds, for those of you who aren't familiar with, bounds is one of the minor dignities that divides up the zodiac signs into a regular number of degrees, and it's assigned to the 5 planets. I cover bounds in detail, by the way, in my dignities class at Kepler. It's one of the most important of the minor dignities. And the program Janus that I like so much has a wheel that's similar to this, that shows me whole sign on the outside, quadrant on the inside, but then it'll show me the bounds also. So absolutely, I pay attention to the bounds, and the bounds apply within both house systems. So like if you had I don't have which planet memorized, but if you had a bound that was, say, the first several degrees of Sagittarius in this chart, it would fall in the whole sign, second house in the quadrant, first house, but you'd still be using the bounds.
Great. Let's move on, and I'm sure people will still chime in, but we want to get more juicy chart examples here.
I've got everything I've got from this point on is chart examples and questions.
Wonderful.
And again, I want to emphasize that these are my own personal explorations. I don't really consider this to be authoritative answers. If I'm giving you ideas that you can go looking in your own charts. And I'm going to bet, by the way, that you got some comments, something along the line of, wow, this explains my chart, or something like that. When I explain this to people, I often get that kind of reaction. So again, think of what I'm giving you here as suggestions rather than authoritative answers. All right.
Fabulous. We're excited.
Good. You can probably tell. Oops, I went too far. There we go. My chart. Here we go. I talked about my daughter's chart. This one is my chart. So I know this person very well. This is me. And there's a couple planets in particular that I want to talk about here. And it's that 2 up at the top of the class, up at the top of the chart there, pardon me. You notice I've got Saturn is in Libra. My ascendant is Capricorn, so Saturn's lord of the ascendant. In traditional astrology, I'm Saturn. Saturn stands for me. And you'll notice that Saturn is in the whole sign, 10th house. And this, by the way, this one is Porphyry, by the way. It's in the whole sign, 10th house, and it's in the quadrant, 9th house. If you combine that 2, I have always thought that my vocation was going to be as teacher. Vocation, 10th house, teacher, 9th. I have always been interested in philosophy and religion as a vocation kind of a thing. At one time I was in seminary. That's again combining 10th house and 9th house meanings. And also Saturn in 10th and 9th would be a very good marker for someone whose final vocation ended up being a traditional astrologer. Tradition, Saturn. Saturn retrograde. I look back into the tradition there. So that's combining 10th and 9th house meanings. My vocation, 10th house, is a 9th house kind of vocation. So there's a combination. Now let's look at Mars there. You'll notice Mars is very angular. The midheavens at 13 Scorpio, Mars is 16 Scorpio, so it's very strong. It's in rulership. But that's not my vocation. something that is very interesting, a little kind of wrinkle in my life history. When I graduated from high school, I was a National Merit Scholar, and I got full scholarships to Annapolis and West Point, and my dad so desperately wanted me to become a career military person, and I turned it down. Broke his heart. But in some ways, that's what my dad wanted me. He wanted me to be a vocation, midheaven of Mars. But where I see Mars play out in my life is Mars in Scorpio describes my closest friends. And I value my closest friends very highly, right by an angle, high value, okay? And a lot of my friends have Mars Scorpio kinds of traits where they're very, very outspoken. They don't mind sharing their opinion. They're a bit on the blunt side. They're independent thinkers. That's who I resonate to. And another way that I look at that, the midheaven points at the 11th house by whole sign. This is a matter of, if you will, importance to me. It is more important to me that I find my community of people who share my values than my career in the normal sense of the term. So there's a sense in which you could say my vocation in terms of what drives me is 11th house kind of a thing. That's what I value, you see? So that midheaven pointing up to the 11th house says, here's what I work on. Here's what I focus on. If I'm happy with the people who share my common values, I'm not worried if I'm making a lot of money, I'm famous. I'm worried about that community. So you see how that's combining the strength of the midheaven with that midheaven pointing that 11th house, group, community. And what kind of community? Mars and Scorpio kind of community. Independent thinkers, people who speak bluntly, people who speak their mind, etc. So there's another example of combining the two house systems. Is it worth getting feedback? Is this making sense? Are we getting...
I have a question, actually.
Go for it.
Okay, so let's see. So we have the Mars and Scorpio there, and it's making sense of your community. What would you say, though, with that 7th house, with that Leo Cancer situation? And is that, would you say that's related, or would you say, oh, well, it's just community, but like the community is made up of individuals, of relationships. So how do you work that out?
Okay, the 7th house in this particular case is very much primary relationship. And the planet that describes 7th house primary relationships is very much that moon. That moon at 28 Cancer, where it's in rulership. And you may notice by that moon's in a tight trine to my Mercury in Pisces. So that moon describes some of my closest friends one-on-one. That moon also describes my 2 marriages. I married moon in Cancer kind of people. That reminds me. Totally forgot. I need to back up here. Pardon me, I forgot something here.
Back up.
Yeah, I need to go back here. My daughter's chart, I need to say something more because I need to talk about me in this chart. It applies to both house systems again. In this chart, Saturn represents the father, so Saturn is me. And notice Saturn is in the 12th house. Saturn in the 12th house can stand for a father that's missing. My wife and I broke up when my daughter was 2. I wasn't in the house as she was growing up. So I was a 12th house father. I was the father who wasn't there. That's a 12th house kind of equality, right? But the other thing about that is that as my daughter got older, I stayed in touch with her. We're very, very close now. As my daughter got older, I more and more brought her into my community, my groups of friends. And one of the things that we did together while she was growing up, my second wife and I played Renaissance Festival together, which was a fifth house kind of activity. And I brought my daughter out to Renaissance Festival with me. So she was a character out in my family, out at Renaissance Festival. And that was a way that my daughter and I bonded, if you will. That's describing my daughter's and my relationship in fifth house, 11th house terms. So in some ways, I was the father that was missing. Her mom and I broke up. I wasn't in the households. And in other ways, I shared a 11th house, fifth house kind of relationship with her. So do you see, I needed both house systems to describe my relationship to my daughter here. You see it?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It's wild. It's just absolutely wild stuff. Do you see why this is the chart that convinced me that I need to pay attention to both?
Yes, and we have some questions actually.
Go for it.
Around that in a way. So people are asking, let's see, how do I encapsulate here? So I want to go back to maybe, because it seems like they asked when you were talking about your vocation and your father and the Mars.
Hang on, here we go. That chart here.
Yeah, and people kind of, I mean, what seems to be the question is, how do you differentiate between how that might show up? I know we're looking retroactively a little bit as we reflect, but is there a way to determine, like someone said, okay, is one the deeper message and motive, and one is showing us how it presents in life? Is one, and with that 10th house, 11th house is like the father's expectations versus what your true desire is. Like, is there a way you would look at that?
Okay, I guess two things. Number one, the looking at vocation, and we're going to talk about this later, I would look at both 10th houses. I'd look at the whole sign 10th house and at the angular one, and in some ways as to which applies to which. This has to do with my particular style as an astrologer. One of the things that I do when I go over the chart, I kind of get a general view for how the two sets of houses intersect. And then whenever I do a chart reading with a person, an awful lot of that is dialogue and questions. So I will know, like in this chart, I'm looking for some sort of 10th, 9th house connection here, but I'm not going to know specifically what that is until I really start talking to the person.
Right.
Okay. Does that help?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Someone also wanted to mention how the way you teach and the way that you deliver these messages is very clear. And they mentioned that Mars really does come out in certain ways.
Yes, it does.
You blade and chisel your teaching. So that's
and no, the more you get to know me, the more you're going to recognize that Mars. You absolutely are.
Great.
And thank you for that. This is a case where my combining being an astrologer with the fact that I was a computer trainer for 20 years really, really helps. Because if you're going to train computer programs, you need to learn to speak very, very clearly. Just side comment with that, this is not specifically related to topic, but you will notice in this chart that my Mercury is in the 29th degree of Pisces, which, if you know traditional astrology, is about as debilitated as you can get. I think I'm doing okay for Mercury in Pisces. So if you've got a debilitated Mercury, take heart.
Great word of wisdom.
Okay. Should we do some more examples?
Moving on. Yeah, let's keep going.
Fantastic. I've got several. We'll do what we can, and we'll do some questions here. And again, remember that these are suggestions of mine. Okay. Okay. This next chart is Allen Ginsberg, if you have not heard of him. And by the way, if it looks like Ginsberg was a bit of a character, which is why I chose that photo. Allen Ginsberg was a poet, a writer, you could call him a media personality, a civil rights activist. He was also active Buddhist. He was involved in the anti-war movement. And where Ginsberg became where he first became well known was a book of poems he published in the late 50s that was called Howl. It was free verse kind of poetry that was very, very extreme confessional kind of poetry. It was talking about his personal life. It was talking about his sex life. It was talking about his drug life. If you've ever heard the 1960s expression, let it all hang out, that's Allen Ginsberg. Okay, he's just out there. He was who he was. He didn't hide. And what I specifically wanted to talk about here, because this is something very important to look for. Notice over in the whole sign first house, which is Pisces. 2 planets are in the whole sign first house that are in the quadrant 12th house. And one of the things that's a very, very consistent kind of thing, if you use whole sign houses, any planets that are above the ascendant in the whole sign first house take on somewhat of a 12th house quality in that they're not really in the person's awareness, but other people who are looking at this person can see, yeah, that's who they are. So if you look at Ginsberg, essentially his chart there is leading with that moon, leading with the moon in Pisces, but it's above the ascendant. So it's like visible to everyone else. And that Mars right on the ascendant is very much like him. And there was a funny sort of an unself-conscious way that Ginsberg had in his poetry and in his personal present. It's like he was just completely sharing who he was. He wasn't hiding anything. There was no cover up. There was no making an impression. He was just out there. There was a sort of a unself-consciousness exposed quality to them. I mean that in a very, very good sense. He was just out there. There was nothing phony about the man. So that moon, first house, definite part of his personality everyone else could see, but 12th house, it's just a part he was not self-conscious about, he was not aware of. That's a very, very consistent interpretive principle when you have a planet in the whole sign first house that's above the ascendant. It's part of their personality, but it's a part that everyone else sees, but the person themselves doesn't see. You see how I'm combining first house and 12th house there? That's a very good and very consistent kind of principle. Keep your eye out for that one there.
That's really fascinating. I wonder, was there anything in his life or biography that indicated that he had that unawareness of that part of his personality?
I guess what there was, it's not so much the unawareness that you would see in him as that just utter lack of self-consciousness. If you read the book of Howl, of his poetry, any of his poetries, it's like, this could have been his private diary. This could have been the kind of thing that people keep hidden in the bottom drawer of a cabinet in their bedroom, and he's publishing it, you see? So I see it in that utter unself-conscious sharing. It's like his moon's just out there, and everyone else sees it, but he's totally unself-conscious about it. That's how I would describe it. Does that help?
Yeah, and what about that Mars there? What would you say?
That Mars, that's Ginsberg. If there's a single planet in the chart that's Ginsberg, it's Mars. And Mars right on the ascendant in Pisces, Mars just above there. One of the things that Ginsberg he was writing in the 1950s, publishing intimate details of his sex life in the 1950s in America. Ginsberg was homosexual. Ginsberg was gay. He was one of the first, not just open, but like in your face open kind of gay men. And that was part of who the man was. So that Mars in your face quality is a very Ginsberg sort of a thing.
I see.
And it really was, he was sort of, it wasn't even like he was saying, look, here's who I am, like it or not. It's just sort of, look, here's who I am. And that's a Marsy kind of a thing, an in-your-face kind of a thing. Did I answer your question there?
Yeah, you did. I'm interested. My chart is configured in that way too. So
okay. Do you have anything of that people above the horizon in your first chart? Other people see that in you, but it's like it's kind of off your awareness. Does that fit?
Yeah. Yeah, it's Jupiter. So
yes.
and others may see me as incredibly exuberant and, you know, optimistic and all these things, and then I don't really see that fully. So
bingo, that's planet above the ascendant in the whole sign first house. You explained it really well. That's very, very consistent. That's a very reliable interpretive piece, by the way.
Love it.
I find that one across the board.
We have a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay, so someone wants to know, what advantages do you find in whole house charts?
Whole house charts, there's a clarity to them. By the way, if I were only going to use one kind of house system, I'd use whole sign, hands down. Actually, when I look at the charts, I kind of think of it as the primary set of houses I'm seeing. Just how I look at it is indeed whole sign. And then the inner wheel here, the quadrant houses, is like a second interpretive set that I'm putting inside the whole sign houses. I will mention, by the way, if there are any of you who are used to just quadrant houses, when you first try looking at whole sign, you may find that it's kind of like having an identity crisis, where you're going, wait a minute, I'm used to having Saturn in my 9th house. How did it move over to the 10th house? What's going on? And it can take a while for you to get used to it. But whole sign's the primary one. I'm not sure if I really answered that question so much as stated a preference, but I find there's a clarity to the whole sign that I don't always get in the quadrant ones.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, so how do you interpret the planetary house joys with this technique?
The honest answer is it depends. And by that, I mean, it would depend on the individual chart that I was looking at. I would tend to pay most attention to house joys by whole sign rather than quadrant. But I would note it if a planet was in its joy in quadrant and not in whole sign. That might end up telling me something. I realize it's kind of a really depends on context stuff, but it is the most honest answer I can give you, which is, well, it depends on the chart. But I'd favor whole sign if that helps.
Yeah, it's the yes answer. Do you want me to keep going with the questions, or do we want to move to the next?
Let's maybe at least do another example, then maybe another questions and so on. I want to hit the core things and see a couple. But in any case, you've got the core ideas now. Everything from this point is examples. So I'll be combining charts that I'm looking at with dialogue, okay? Here we go. Jimi Hendrix. I know Jimi Hendrix goes back for a while. I'm assuming people have still heard of Jimi Hendrix. His music is still quite popular. This is the man who coined the famous word, something to the effect of, after me, you'll never be able to listen to surf music again. And there's two groups of planets that I want to look at in his chart. And one of them, do you notice he's got that 3-planet stellium, and it's got that first house, 12th house mix that I talked about in the previous chart? Same thing, that's a part of Hendrix that's just out there, that's totally visible. But I think the most important planets in this particular chart, take a look over on the right side of the chart, that Moon and Jupiter conjunction. That's gorgeous, because you've got Moon in Cancer where it's in rulership, Jupiter in Cancer where it's exalted, and the two planets are conjunct. And by quadrant, by that inside wheel, those two planets are seventh house. They're angular. They're quite strong. But by whole sign houses, they are in the eighth house there. And what I want to point out about that, there's a concept in traditional astrology called aversion. If you look at Sagittarius there, which is his first house, and if you look at Cancer, which is over in the whole sign eighth house, those two signs have no traditional aspect between them. The Ptolemaic, they don't make a sextile, they don't make a square, they don't make a trine, they don't make an opposition. Those two planets would be referred to as averse, the ascendant. Notice Jupiter rules the ascendant. And if averse has a certain quality of being out of awareness and out of control. Part of what made Jimi Hendrix is that absolutely wild intensity he got at his best, where he could, it's like he was constantly pushing as close to the edge of completely out of control as he could partly be, and then sometimes going over it. I think that Moon and Jupiter there, angular, strong in the seventh house, but having somewhat of that out of awareness, out of control of the eighth house, is what describes a lot of the man's energy. That's what made him so great. The ability to just be able to totally throw himself and have that incredible intensity to his music. So you see how that Moon Jupiter are combining the angularity of seventh house with that kind of awareness, kind of out of control of the eighth house there. And the other possible, this is a little more tentative, but I'll mention this as a possible suggestion, is you've got that opposition going between Mercury, Sun, Venus in the whole sign first house over to Saturn and Uranus, but especially Saturn over in the whole sign seventh, but they're in quadrant houses that Sun and Venus and Mercury are quadrant 12th house. And one of the things the 12th house could be is a house of self-undoing, where an awful lot of Jimi Hendrix's lifestyle, the same thing that made him a very, very great guitarist, made his life somewhat, out of control. He was a party kind of a guy. If it moved, he slept with it. He was seriously into drugs, that kind of thing. And you could say that that sort of lifestyle in some ways led to his own undoing and his own death. I'm a little more tentative with that one than I am with the other explanation, but do you see how I got that from the first 12th over there? Okay. Questions, dialogue at this point. Is this still making sense? Are you getting ideas?
I think so. I found it interesting that his Mars degree and sign pretty close to yours.
Yeah, by the way, I love Hendrix. And also there is stuff, Hendrix at his absolute best. I don't know how else to put it. It can make the guitar scream. And there's a part of that I just really, really resonate to. And by the way, while you're talking about, that's a case there where that Mars is not terribly strong by angle, but it's in a succeeding house, but the Mars is 12th house also. So that could be also that very, very strong drive and intensity there also.
That makes sense. Okay. On to the Q&A, and everyone, if you have questions, please ask in the Q&A so I can get to them. Okay, so someone early on asked, it's the same person asked two questions, so I'll just say both. So they asked about the IC for the mom and the MC for the dad, and then do you use cusp for transits or
Okay.
or ingress or whole sign for ingress to house?
Okay. I'm going to answer the second one first. I do not pay attention to the exact degree of the house cusps. I don't track it that much. I pay attention to the rough. So like in this chart here, I'd pay attention to like early Sagittarius is where it fits from quadrant 11 to 12, but that exact degree of the in-between house cusp, I don't pay that much attention to the exact degree. I do pay attention to the angles, to the ascendant, to the descendant, to the MC, to the IC. The other question, it's kind of tangent to what we're doing, but basically about fourth house and 10th house. That's another one that it depends. In traditional, the fourth house is the whole family. And it could refer to either of the parents, to either of the ancestors. That's the most traditional interpretation of that. And 10th house being in traditional texts, associated the mother was 10th house is spouse of the father. That's where they came from. When I'm looking for a parent first, I'll look for fourth house. And it's only where I'm trying to differentiate between mother and father. That's one where I might ask some questions. But for mother and father, I also pay attention to Saturn, Venus, and sun or moon. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Do we have another question, or should we look at it? Go ahead.
It's up to you. Up to you.
Go ahead.
Okay, so and that person said thank you. You cleared up. You cleared it up for them. So
good.
Let's see. So when pertaining to this chart, we're looking at the ninth house. They said, what about that Neptune there being in the ninth and or the 11th? But then there's also the 10th. What's going on? What's going on with that? With the Neptune?
I'm not sure. I haven't looked closely at Neptune in this chart. I don't have an answer right off the top of your head.
All right.
The quick answer, I don't have a quick interpretation of that one for you.
Okay. Well,
and just also, I should let you know, just style-wise, the outer planets, namely Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, I generally do not pay an awful lot of attention to those unless they're very near one of the inner planets.
Okay.
That's how I tend to do with them. So like in this chart, the fact that Uranus and Saturn are quite close to each other, that I pay attention to. Uranus and Saturn, that's ugly. That's really, really stressful pressure. And with that being opposite the Sun, Venus, Mercury, that's a real threatening kind of thing. So no, the Neptune by itself, no, I don't really have a strong sense of what that's all about.
Okay.
Should we do another example and then maybe do some more questions and dialogue?
Sounds perfect.
Okay. I'm assuming, by the way, because we're coming near the end of our time, I'm assuming you folks at least have enough to get started with, start doing explanation on your own, because that's my job, is to just get you so you can start playing with these on your own. Okay. Okay. This is an interesting one. Margaret Thatcher. If you've not heard of her, her nickname was the Iron Lady. She was Prime Minister of Great Britain in the first half of the 80s. First woman to be Prime Minister, and she was very prominent in politics at that kind of thing. And she developed that nickname, the Iron Lady, because she was very strong, forceful, had strong opinions. She was aggressive. If she thought she was right, she was going to act it, and so on. The two most important planets in this chart, I think, are, you notice Saturn is dead on the ascendant. Saturn, Scorpio, ascendant, Iron Lady. We could go home, right? But notice that Saturn is in a mutual reception with that Mars. Saturn is in Scorpio where Mars rules. Mars is in Libra where Saturn is exalted, okay? And Saturn, Mars is ruler of the first house. And what's important there, what I wanted to talk about was that planets in the whole sign 12, especially Mars there, because it's so important. Mars is in quadrant 11th, whole sign 12th. And two ways I interpreted that. Number one, when she did become prime minister and she was elected, there was an awful lot of legwork that went into that. Tons and tons and tons of her building local connections, building party connections, building groups, building supports, that kind of thing, which could be an 11th house kind of a subject. But the other thing of that Mars is I always got the feeling that when we saw something of Thatcher and some kind of decision, there was a bunch of stuff going on behind the scenes that we weren't seeing that sort of led to how she was acting. And that's kind of a 12th house quality of Mars also. But the other way that Mars and the 11th, 12th house is Thatcher, when she did leave office, she was not really voted out of office. There was behind the scenes party maneuvering that went on that sort of shoved her out. Think of behind the scenes party maneuvering that betrayed her. Party maneuvering, 11th house, behind the scenes that betrayed her, 12th house. So you see how that Mars is talking to both 11th house kind of feel and 12th house kind of feel. So that's another way I'm combining these here. Okay, now's a good time for a couple questions. We'll maybe get to one more example, maybe not, depending what we've got with questions, okay?
Okay, great. I also want to note some of these questions, everyone, they have been answered in the presentation. So if you want to go watch the recording when it's available, you'll get it answered in that way, and you could take more time with it. So let's see. People are first of all, in the chat, we have a lot of people just applauding you and saying how grateful they are. And I know Kepler's grateful to have you because this is outstanding.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you find this interesting. Obviously, you could tell I do too. I love sharing this stuff. And if you folks take this and run with it, I'd be thrilled.
Yeah, I think it's unanimous here. People are loving it. So
thank you.
There are the questions that people seem to really want to know about are the house systems, which you've already spoken about. So is there anything you want to add in that? People are asking about why would I use porphyry over the other? Why would I use equal? Why do I use this quadrant? And you've spoken about it a good amount, but I wonder if there's more to it that can make it more clear for folks.
I will give you, well, first of all, whole sign, I think we've established are important, okay? I used to use equal sign. That's also a very good one. I think of equal as kind of a variant of whole sign, okay? Now, in terms of the quadrant house systems, the ones that I think, and by the way, this is a bit beyond the scope of this webinar, but we're doing, the different quadrant house systems vary in terms of how they divide up the intermediate house custs, how they do it in terms of quadrants. Some do it in terms of dividing up space, and some do it in terms of dividing up time. Of the time-based houses, the one that I find most interesting is Placidus. And the reason that I find that one interested, there's a British astrologer named Deb Holding, who's just absolutely fabulous, who, by the way, has about the best. Deb Holding has a book of, Deb Holding has the best book on the houses that's available. I think it's called The Houses, Temples in the Sky. But what she says is she likes the Placidus house system because there's a connection between how the Placidus house cusps divide up time and the planetary hours, where each of the houses gets exactly 2 planetary hours. That's a very good justification. The porphyry one I personally favor number one, because it's very easy to calculate. You just take each quadrant, the amount of distance like between the midheaven and the ascendant, divided up in zodiac degrees, and just trisect it. And the reason I chose to do that one is that I mentioned Bruce Schofield earlier. He found that the house divisions for porphyry timed well, that he could see a transit onto a porphyry house cusp was more likely to produce an event than any other of the quadrant kinds of house systems. The one other kind of house system that I will mention, this one's not used as much, there's one called Campanus. It's one of the space-based ones. And the 20th century astrologer Dane Rudhyar favored Campanus because he did something he called person-centered astrology. And if you went and stood on the earth and just looked up at the sky and divided it up into 12 pieces, you'd be seeing Campanus houses. That's the advantage. The disadvantage of Campanus houses is they get very, very warped in north latitudes. So they do not work well in very extreme latitudes. Oh, and yeah, and the one other thing a reason that I like to pay attention to porphyry houses is porphyry houses are very popular with evolutionary astrologers. Porphyry is Jeffrey Wolf Green's favorite system. So I'm sort of, if you will, meeting the evolutionary astrologers there. There's just a couple of thoughts off the top of my head on house systems. Does that give you a little bit to think about?
That was incredibly exhaustive. Thank you so much.